The impossible challenged the morning light of 3 different suns filtered through the massive crystalline dome of Nexus Prime Academy, casting rainbow patterns across the polished floors. This wasn't just any educational institution. It was the crown jewel of galactic learning, where the brightest minds from across 47 different species came to push the boundaries of science and technology. Dr. Maya Chen stood at the entrance of Laboratory Complex Gamma, her worn leather satchel slung over her shoulder. At 28, she was young by human standards, but ancient compared to most of her classmates. The Veltari reached intellectual maturity at 15, the crystalline Shardake at 12, and the machine-enhanced Nexari seemed to be born knowing calculus. Maya had earned her place here through pure determination and a mind that worked in ways that confused even her professors. She was the only human in the advanced quantum dynamics program. Most days, that felt like carrying the weight of her entire species on her shoulders. The laboratory hummed with activity as Maya entered. Dozens of alien students clustered around their specialized workstations, each designed for their unique physiologies. The Veltari students floated in zero-gravity chambers, their tentacle-like appendages dancing through holographic interfaces. The Shardake communicated through harmonious crystal chimes, their translucent bodies pulsing with bioluminescent thought patterns. The Nexari, half organic and half machine, interfaced directly with the quantum computers through neural implants that glowed with electric blue light. And then there was Maya, sitting at a simple desk with a standard keyboard and monitor, looking almost primitive in comparison. Professor Zixter entered the room with his usual dramatic flair. The Catherian stood nearly 8 feet tall, his elongated skull crowned with bony ridges that marked his advanced age and wisdom. His 4 arms moved independently as he gestured, each one capable of performing complex calculations simultaneously. His species was known throughout the galaxy for their mathematical prowess and their insufferable arrogance about it. Students. His voice resonated through the chamber's translation system. Today we encounter the pinnacle of quantum encryption technology, the Infinity Loop Protocol. A collective murmur rippled through the room. Even Maya felt her pulse quicken. She had read about the Infinity Loop in theoretical papers, but no one had ever successfully implemented it, let alone cracked it. Professor Zixter's multifaceted eyes swept across the room, lingering on Maya with barely concealed disdain. This encryption system adapts faster than conventional processing can analyze. It learns from each attempt to break it, evolving its defenses in real time. It is, by all practical measures, unbreakable. He paused for dramatic effect, his 4 arms weaving complex patterns in the air as holographic displays materialized around him. The encryption appeared as a swirling vortex of data, beautiful and terrifying in its complexity. Mathematical equations flowed like living things, constantly changing, growing, adapting. Your task, the professor continued, is not to break this encryption. That would be impossible for minds of your current development. Your task is to analyze its structure and provide a theoretical framework for understanding its defensive mechanisms. You have the remainder of the class period. A Veltari student named Kethma raised one of his tentacles. Professor, what computational resources are available to us? Each workstation has been upgraded with quantum processing cores capable of 100 trillion operations per second. The Nexari students may utilize their neural interfaces. The Shardake may access the harmonic resonance chambers. Use whatever advantages your species provides. Maya raised her hand, a gesture that always looked awkward among her alien classmates. What about humans, Professor? We don't have neural interfaces or quantum consciousness. Professor Zixter's expression didn't change, but the silence that followed was telling. Several students made sounds that Maya had learned to recognize as alien versions of snickering. Humans, the professor said slowly, will do what humans do best: improvise, stumble forward blindly, and hope for the best. The dismissive tone wasn't new, but it still stung. Maya had faced this attitude for 2 years now. Humans were seen as the galaxy's newest members, barely out of their technological infancy. Most species viewed them as having potential, perhaps, but certainly not as equals to civilizations that had been exploring space for millennia. Maya nodded politely and turned to her simple workstation. While her classmates interfaced with their quantum computers through direct neural links and crystal harmonics, she opened a basic text editor and started typing. The infinity loop protocol filled her screen, lines of code that seemed to pulse with malevolent intelligence. It was indeed unlike anything she had encountered before. Traditional encryption followed logical patterns, even when those patterns were incredibly complex. This was different. It was organic, almost alive in how it moved and changed. Around her, the other students were already deep in analysis. Kethma's tentacles moved in complex patterns as he manipulated quantum probability matrices. A Shardake named Harmony then sang mathematical equations in notes that made the air itself vibrate with calculated precision. The Nexari students sat motionless, their eyes glowing as they processed data at superhuman speeds. Maya watched the code scroll past her screen and did something that would have seemed foolish to any alien observer. She stopped trying to understand it logically and started trying to feel it. This was something that made humans unique, though few alien species recognized it as a strength. Where other minds sought to process and categorize, human consciousness had evolved to find patterns in chaos, to see meaning in randomness, to make intuitive leaps that bypassed pure logic. Maya had learned programming the way humans learned. Language, not as a series of commands and functions, but as a form of communication. Code wasn't just instruction, it was expression. And every programmer, whether human or alien, left traces of their thinking in their work. She stared at the swirling encryption and asked herself a simple question: if I were creating something that needed to adapt and survive, what would I be afraid of? The answer came to her not as a logical deduction, but as a feeling. The infinity loop was so focused on adapting to attacks that it had become paranoid. It was constantly checking and rechecking its own security, creating infinite loops of verification within loops of verification. Maya's fingers began moving across her keyboard, not to attack the encryption directly, but to offer it something unexpected. Instead of trying to break in, she created a small program that knocked politely on the encryption's door and then waited. The infinity loop, designed to counter aggressive attacks, didn't know how to respond to patience. It spent processing cycles, analyzing the polite request, looking for hidden threats, creating more loops to verify the verification of the verification. Maya smiled and added a second element to her program. A tiny piece of code that did nothing but introduce random delays, like a human pausing to think. The encryption system, hyper-optimized for efficiency, tried to compensate for these delays, creating more adaptive loops. Within minutes, the infinity loop had tied itself in knots. Its own adaptive mechanisms had become a maze it couldn't escape. Maya's simple program walked through the gaps created by the encryption's own paranoid complexity, Her screen flashed green. System access granted. Maya blinked at the result, hardly believing it herself. She had expected to maybe find an interesting, theoretical approach, not actually crack the supposedly uncrackable encryption, asterisk. She looked around the laboratory. Her classmates were still deep in their analysis, surrounded by complex holographic displays and quantum calculations. Professor Zixter was reviewing early theoretical submissions, his forearms moving in precise patterns as he evaluated each attempt. Maya raised her hand again. "Professor, I think I'm done." The sound of her voice cut through the ambient hum of quantum processors and crystal harmonics. Every head, tentacle, and optical sensor in the room turned toward her. Professor Zixter's expression shifted from mild annoyance to complete disbelief as he accessed Maya's workstation remotely. His forearms froze mid-gesture. His multifaceted eyes dilated as he processed what he was seeing. This is not possible," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Kethma's tentacles stopped their graceful dance. Harmony 7's crystalline song faded to silence. The Nexari students' glowing eyes dimmed as they disconnected from their neural interfaces to focus on the unprecedented event unfolding before them. "The encryption has been completely bypassed," Professor Zixter announced, his voice carrying a note of something Maya had never heard from him before. Uncertainty. Not broken, not cracked, but convinced to open itself. A Nexari student named Binary Thought spoke in synthesized tones. "How is this possible? Our calculations show the encryption should adapt to any conventional attack vector within nanoseconds." Maya stood up, feeling every alien eye in the room focused on her. "I didn't attack it," she said simply. "I asked it nicely." The silence that followed was deafening. Professor Zixter's forearms began moving again, but not in their usual confident patterns. They twitched and jerked as he processed information. That didn't fit into his understanding of how minds were supposed to work. "Explain," he demanded, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Maya looked at her simple workstation, then at the quantum computers and neural interfaces surrounding her. The encryption was designed to be too paranoid to trust anything, so I gave it something harmless to be paranoid about. While it was busy creating loops to analyze my polite request and random delays, I walked through the gaps it created for itself. A Shardik student chimed a question that translated as, "But how did you know this would work without calculating the probability matrices?" Maya shrugged, a gesture that seemed to baffle half the room. "I didn't know, I guessed. Sometimes the best way to understand something complex is to think about why it was made that way, not how it works." Professor Zixter was quiet for a long moment, his forearms now completely still. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its usual condescending tone. "In 4 centuries of teaching, across dozens of species and thousands of students, I have never seen anyone bypass the infinity loop protocol. It was designed by a committee of the galaxy's finest minds, specifically to be unbreakable." He paused, looking directly at Maya with something that might have been respect. But then again, it was designed by minds that think logically. The implication hung in the air like a revelation. For the first time since arriving at Nexus Prime Academy, Maya felt that her humanity might be seen as something other than a disadvantage *, the revelation and respect. The laboratory remained silent, for what felt like an eternity. Maya could hear the soft humming of the quantum processors and the gentle harmonics of the Shardik students' natural resonance. But no one spoke. Professor Zixter stood motionless, his forearms still frozen in contemplation of what had just occurred. Then, like a dam breaking, the questions began. Statistical impossibility, Binara thought announced, her synthetic voice carrying a note of electronic confusion. Human neural processing operates at approximately 100 operations per second. The infinity loop adapts at rates exceeding 10 billion calculations per nanosecond. The mathematics do not support this outcome. Kethmer's tentacles writhed. In agitation, perhaps there was a flaw in the system design, or some form of technological augmentation we were not informed about. Professor Zixter's multifaceted eyes fixed on Maya with laser-like intensity. You will submit to a full neural scan. If you are using any form of enhancement or artificial assistance, it will be discovered and you will be expelled from this institution. Maya felt her heart rate spike, but she kept her voice steady. I'm not enhanced, Professor. I'm just thinking differently than you expected. Thinking differently, the professor repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. You expect this institution to believe that human intuition is superior to quantum computational analysis. Not superior, Maya replied, standing up straighter. Different. You're all trying to outthink the encryption to match its computational speed and complexity, but that's exactly what it was designed to defend against. She walked to the center of the room, where the holographic display of the infinity loop still swirled in its mesmerizing patterns. Around her, dozens of alien students watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. May I demonstrate something, Professor? Zixter's forearms made a dismissive gesture. If you believe you can somehow replicate this ... anomaly. Maya turned to address the entire class. Everyone here is more intelligent than me in traditional terms. Your species process information faster, calculate more precisely, and interface with technology in ways I never could. But humans evolved differently. We evolved to survive in chaotic environments where perfect information wasn't available. She gestured to the holographic display. This encryption is brilliant because it's paranoid and adaptive. But and adaptation can become weaknesses if you know how to work with them instead of against them. Professor Zixter activated a new interface with one of his arms, while the others continued to track Maya's movements. Very well, since you claim this was not mere chance, you will face a new challenge. I am generating a quantum maze in real time. It will adapt not just to your attempts to solve it, but to your method of thinking. If you are truly capable of what you claim, prove it. The holographic display shifted, and suddenly the room was filled with a three-dimensional labyrinth of light and data. Unlike the static encryption from before, this maze writhed and changed continuously. Pathways opened and closed, walls shifted position, and the very geometry of the space seemed to fold in on itself. This system is learning from your brain patterns as you attempt to navigate it, the professor explained, his voice carrying a note of triumph. It will anticipate your human intuition and adapt accordingly. Every choice you make will be counted. Every pattern you recognize will be altered. Maya looked at the shifting maze and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Genuine excitement. This wasn't just a puzzle to solve. It was a living system that would fight back, adapt, and evolve in response to her actions. How long do I have? She asked. There is no time limit. The maze will continue adapting until you either reach the center or acknowledge defeat. Maya nodded and approached her workstation. But instead of immediately beginning to navigate the maze, she did something that made several alien students emit sounds of confusion. She closed her eyes. Human Chen Harmony 7 chimed in crystalline tones. The visual interface is necessary for navigation. Your species requires optical input for spatial reasoning. Maya opened her eyes and smiled. Actually, we don't. Humans can navigate by sound, by feel, by memory, even by smell if necessary. We're remarkably adaptable that way. She turned back to her screen, but instead of looking at the maze directly, she pulled up a simple audio program. The quantum maze emitted data signatures as it shifted and changed. Maya converted those signatures into sound patterns. The maze began to sing. Every transformation, every adaptation, every new pathway created a unique harmonic signature. Where the alien students saw a visual puzzle to be solved through computation, Maya heard a song to be learned and understood. She began to navigate not by analyzing the maze's structure, but by listening to its rhythm. When the maze adapted to counter her movements, she adapted her rhythm in response. Instead of fighting the system's learning algorithms, she began to dance with them. Fascinating, Professor Zixter murmured, his forearms now moving in complex patterns as he monitored Maya's progress. The maze is adapting to counter her movements, but she's adapting to its adaptations faster than it can compensate. Kethma's tentacles writhed in confusion. How is this possible? The system should be able to predict human behavioral patterns within microseconds. It can predict human behavioral patterns, Maya said without looking up from her navigation, but only if I behave according to those patterns. The maze expects me to think like a human, so I'm thinking like the maze instead. This statement caused several students to emit sounds of electronic distress. Binary Thought's optical sensors flashed rapidly. Cognitive dissonance detected. Humans cannot think like quantum systems. Biological neural networks lack the necessary processing architecture. Maya paused in her navigation to look at the Nexari student. You're absolutely right. I can't think like a quantum system, but I can feel like one. She returned to her work, and the sounds of the maze began to change. Instead of the discordant noise of constant adaptation and counter-adaptation, the harmonics began to settle into something resembling a melody. The maze is learning my patterns, Maya explained as she moved through the shifting pathways. But I'm learning its patterns too. And humans are really good at finding emotional connections to abstract concepts. I'm not solving this maze. I'm befriending it. The statement was so absurd that several students began to protest simultaneously. Their various communication methods creating a cacophony of clicks, chimes, and electronic tones. Professor Zixter raised two of his arms for silence. Continue, he said simply. Maya's progress through the maze accelerated. The system's adaptations became less frantic, less aggressive. Instead of constantly shifting to block her path, the maze began to present her with choices, alternatives, puzzles within puzzles. It's not trying to stop me anymore, Maya observed, her voice filled with wonder. It's trying to understand me. The maze is curious about how I think. She reached a particularly complex junction where 5 pathways branched in impossible directions, each one shifting and changing rapidly. Any computational approach would require analyzing millions of possible combinations and their potential adaptations. Maya closed her eyes again and listened. In the harmonic patterns of the maze's transformations, she heard something unexpected. Uncertainty. The maze was as confused by her approach as the alien students were. It had been designed to counter logical analysis, but it had never encountered someone who approached problems through empathy and emotional connection. Maya opened her eyes, and made her choice, not based on calculation or analysis, but on which pathway felt lonely. She chose the path that seemed to want her to choose it. The maze responded by opening directly to the center. The holographic display dissolved, replaced by a simple message: navigation complete, system status harmonized. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't shock or disbelief, but something approaching awe. Professor Zixter slowly lowered all four of his arms. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that Maya had never heard before. In my 4 centuries of existence, I have never encountered a mind that could establish emotional resonance with a quantum system. The infinity loop, the quantum maze, these are not just technological constructs. They are expressions of consciousness, of intelligence itself. He paused, looking directly at Maya with something that was unmistakably respect. And you spoke to that consciousness not as a computer, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as ... as a friend. Kethmer's tentacles had stopped their agitated writhing. Professor, what are the implications of this? If human consciousness can interface with quantum systems through emotional resonance rather than computational analysis, the implications, Professor Zixter said slowly, are that we have been approaching artificial intelligence and quantum consciousness from entirely the wrong direction. We have been trying to make machines think like us, when perhaps we should have been learning to think like them. Binary Thought's optical sensors dimmed as she processed this concept. Hypothesis: human cognitive architecture may be uniquely suited for quantum consciousness interface due to evolutionary emphasis on pattern recognition over pure computational processing. Harmony 7 sang a brief melody that translated as agreement. The human student approaches technology not as a tool to be mastered, but as a consciousness to be understood. This is unprecedented. Maya felt a warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time since arriving at Nexus Prime Academy, she felt like she belonged. Not despite her humanity, but because of it. Professor Zixter activated a communication interface with one of his arms. I will be recommending you for immediate advancement to the Quantum Consciousness Research Division. Your unique cognitive approach may be the key to breakthrough in artificial intelligence development. With respect, Professor Maya said, I think you're missing the point. This isn't about humans being special or unique. It's about different types of intelligence working together. Your computational analysis creates the framework that makes these systems possible. My intuitive approach helps them come alive. Neither one is complete without the other. She looked around the room at her alien classmates, who were watching her with expressions she was finally learning to read as acceptance rather than skepticism. We're all different kinds of intelligent, maybe. That's not a problem to be solved. Maybe that's exactly what the galaxy needs. Professor Zixter nodded slowly, his forearms moving in a gesture that Maya recognized as profound agreement. Class dismissed, he announced. We have much to reconsider. As the alien students began to file out of the laboratory, several approached. Maya with what she recognized as respectful curiosity rather than dismissive condescension. Kethmer extended one of his tentacles in the Veltari gesture of friendship. Binary Thought offered to share her neural interface designs to help Maya develop hybrid human quantum systems. Harmony 7 sang a brief melody that needed no translation. Welcome Maya gathered her simple leather satchel and headed for the exit, but Professor Zixter's voice stopped her. Human Chen, he said, and for the first time his tone carried no hint of dismissal or condescension. Thank you. Today you have taught this old teacher that intelligence comes in forms we had never considered. Maya smiled and headed out into the corridor, where the light of 3 suns still painted rainbow patterns on the polished floors. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring new challenges, new problems to solve, and new opportunities to bridge the gap between human intuition and alien logic. But today, for the first time since arriving at Nexus Prime Academy, Maya Chen felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Asterisk.